Well, the dual theory of human resources and business performance, which is the rough title of my next book, calls attention to the fact that there is not necessarily one best way to manage people in an enterprise. And in the last 15 years, it starts with 1990 in an article that my colleague here, Dan Mitchell, and my colleague at USC, Ed Lawler, and I wrote. We called attention to the fact that certain human resource management practices seem to have positive associations with or effects on company financial performance, return on investment, revenue growth, revenue per employee, things like that. Those practices have come to be called high involvement human resource practices or high involvement work practices. They include such things as employment continuity, very careful employee selection, targeted hiring, the use of teams and decentralization to get work done, a significant amount of money put into variable pay as opposed to put into just salary or fringe benefits, usually in the form of a profit share or a bonus or a stock grant or a stock option. Business information sharing with employees on a systematic basis, training and development for employees, and seventh, keeping status differentials, whether parking spaces, office allocations, or CEO pay relative to employee pay, small rather than large. And in the literature, these several practices have been labeled high involvement human resource practices, and a lot of people have been quick to label them best practices. And what I've attempted to show through my statistical analyses is there's another set of practices for some people who work in organizations. I call those low involvement human resource practices. There's not much employment continuity, not much variable pay, selection is not targeted, the work is done individually, largely in teams, little training or development, little business information shared with employees, status differentials don't come into the picture very much, with one exception I'll get to. Those folks, unlike the high involvement folks who are managed as assets where you hope to add value, it costs you money to invest in them, but you can think of it as an internal rate of return on the investment, hence an asset approach. Those in this second group, which I call the peripheral, the first group of the core, the peripheral are managed for one overriding reason, and that's to keep payroll or labor costs down, labor expense control. Part-time employment, temporary employment, contract for very specific periods of employment, movement of some employees to vendors/suppliers, and most particularly outsourcing, leasing or renting employees are the main ways that we see this peripheral employment having taken shape. Most companies talk about the first group and their approach about people as assets, but most of those very same companies have some core employees managed by high involvement practices and some peripheral employees managed by low involvement practices. The statistical work shows that the low involvement practices can also enhance or leverage return on capital investment, revenue per employee, total revenue growth, and things like that. So that the trick may become for many companies determining what the proportion is of people managed through high vis-a-vis low involvement practices rather than being strictly one or the other. In the same work that I've referred to here, I show that about a third of the workforce, the US workforce at least, is employed in a peripheral context and the remainder in a core context. If you go back decade by decade, almost everybody was employed under these traditional core arrangements. One of the most interesting things about this phenomenon is that it isn't just an employer preference, it's an employee preference. If it were just an employer preference, it would meet with a lot of opposition, you wouldn't have seen the growth. But in the last 15, 20 years especially, lots of people prefer to work for outsourcing companies. They get flexibility of diversity of experiences. They're not stuck in one place. A lot of people prefer temporary work versus full-time. A lot of people prefer part-time work. Quite a few prefer to be on contract for a fixed duration and then move on. So you've got a kind of a matching on both sides of the labor market, which helps to explain why this phenomenon has occurred. Tied in with it, of course, is the great amount of offshore outsourcing that companies do, which of course creates employment in other nations. It can decrease employment here, but if the totality of the labor costs are reduced, it reduces product prices, increases the demand for a firm's products or goods, services or goods, and thus that firm starts to add more capital and add more labor. So in the longer term, this should be an employment enhancing effect rather than an employment reducing effect. In any case, the emphatic point that I want to make here is that most firms do have both types of employees, and for each firm it becomes a question of what would be the most appropriate balance for that particular firm, or if it's a large diversified firm, its business units. The statistical work also shows one other very interesting thing. You don't get gains in business performance by continuing to add and add and add peripheral employment. That turns around at a certain stage, generally beyond a third of your workforce, so that if you start to go to 40 and 50%, you're going to do worse off from a financial performance point of view than if you stayed at about a third, a peripheral workforce, maybe 30%, 28%, something like that. So that, in a nutshell, is the dual theory of human resources and business performance.